She gave birth to a black baby, but her husband was white. He abandoned her on the spot without hearing any explanations. But when the DNA test came back, the truth was something no one could have imagined. Imagine being betrayed not only by the love of your life, but also by reality itself. When Carolina held her son for the first time, she didn't expect that moment to turn into the worst nightmare of her life. Her husband, Marcos, looked at the baby, then at her, and without saying a word, turned his back and walked away. But the truth behind this story will leave you speechless. Carolina was living what every woman dreams of when she imagines the most awaited moment of her life, the arrival of her child. Her pregnancy had gone smoothly, without any major complications, and she had prepared herself lovingly for the day when her baby would finally arrive in the world. She and Marcos, her husband, had always been inseparable, in love and with clear plans for the future. They both saw a full life ahead of them, building a family that would be the solid foundation for years to come. They were both overjoyed. With each ultrasound, Carolina saw her son's face forming, and Marcos couldn't hide his smile as he watched his wife's belly grow. They were ready. When the big day arrived, the hospital was full of expectations. Carolina was nervous, of course, like any first-time mother, but she was surrounded by her husband's love. She wanted him to be by her side, holding her hand, supporting her with every breath, every contraction. But when the baby was born, what was supposed to be the greatest of moments of joy turned into a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The newborn was placed on Carolina's lap, and she soon realized something that made her freeze. He didn't look like Marcos. He didn't look like her. Her baby had dark skin, very different from the light tone of her own skin and Marcos's. At first, Carolina didn't know what to do. She looked at the baby, looked at Marcos, and tried to understand. Something was wrong, but she couldn't put the pieces together. The shock wasn't just the baby's skin tone, but the absence of any plausible explanation. Marcos seemed as silent as she was. There were no smiles, no cries of joy, just a silence that hung in the air. Carolina, who expected her husband to share in the happiness of that moment, noticed that he was distant. He couldn't look at the baby. He couldn't look at her. Confusion overtook Carolina, but it wasn't just her who felt disoriented. When the news spread around a hospital, the discomfort was evident. There were furtive glances, hushed whispers, and an atmosphere of tension that set in right after the birth. Some people tried to be discreet, but the questions kept popping into Carolina's head. How could this have happened? What didn't she know? The idea that something was wrong with her marriage began to loom like a shadow in Carolina's mind. But she wasn't ready to accept it. The first night was the hardest. The pain of childbirth was present, but the emotional pain became more poignant with each passing hour. Marcos had withdrawn, not just physically, but emotionally. He was there, sitting next to her, but it was as if he was somewhere else, distant, absent. Carolina tried to talk, tried to understand what he was feeling, but his words were short, dry, and didn't reflect the confusion in her own mind. Deep down, Carolina wondered if something wasn't right. She tried to rationalize, but the truth began to seep into her mind like a slow, painful, and unavoidable sting. She found herself thinking of all the possibilities, trying to understand why the baby bore no resemblance to them. She began to wonder if Marcos had been unfaithful. But she didn't want to believe that. She didn't want to believe that the person she loved could have done something so cruel. But his behavior was getting stranger and stranger, and she couldn't ignore the signs any longer. As the days went by, the situation got worse. Marcos seemed even more distant, colder. He didn't touch the baby. He wasn't interested in his diet, his sleep, or his needs. Carolina, who had always dreamed of sharing parenthood with him, now felt alone. The physical pain of postpartum was hard to bear, but the emotional pain she was experiencing was even more intense. Her husband was growing distant by the minute, by the second. The lack of support she felt seemed to be the worst part. In Carolina's head, a whirlwind of feelings haunted her. She wondered if she was being paranoid, but the emptiness in Marcos's voice, The glances he avoided, the distance he put between them were all clear signs that something was very wrong. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She didn't want to believe it, but the possibility that Marcos could have been unfaithful took over her mind. She began to feel lost, not knowing who to trust, not knowing whether to confront him or just try to understand what was going on. Everything seemed confusing, like a labyrinth where she couldn't see the way out. She clung to the hope that it was all a big coincidence, an illusion, that the baby's skin tone was just an unforeseen genetic issue, something that, in her mind, made no sense, but which she tried to convince herself could happen. But with each passing day, Marcos's absence and the lack of any concrete explanation became unbearable. It wasn't long before Carolina's thoughts began to darken. She needed answers. What she didn't know was that her life was about to change forever. The DNA test she was unknowingly about to order would reveal more than she could bear. A devastating and unbelievable truth was about to emerge. What she discovered was not just Marcos's betrayal, but something even deeper, something she would never have imagined. The DNA test would not only unmask her husband, but reveal secrets that would explode her life into 1,000 pieces, leaving her groundless and heartbroken. And so Carolina would face the biggest challenge of her life, accepting reality and getting back on her feet in the face of a pain she never imagined she could bear. Carolina's emotional pain intensified every day. She could no longer look at Marcos without wondering what was really happening to him, to her, to the baby. The tension in the air was palpable, a feeling that something even deeper was about to be revealed. She felt like a puppet whose strings were being pulled without her having any control, without knowing who was behind it all. Like a ghost, doubt haunted her, and Marcos's smile seemed to be just a mask he wore to hide the truth. That night, Carolina decided that she could no longer live in uncertainty. She knew she needed an answer, not only for herself, but also for her son. After all, who was he? Where did he come from? How could she, as a mother, protect her son without understanding the true origin of the situation? Her mind began to open up to possibilities that had previously seemed unthinkable. It was in this moment of desperation that she made the decision to do something that would change everything. She would ask for a DNA test. It was an act of courage, but also of pain. In making this choice, Carolina knew that she was opening a Pandora's box, a box full of secrets that she might never be able to close again. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she didn't see any other option. The weight of doubt was unbearable. She could no longer look at her son without wondering why he didn't look like her husband, why his eyes weren't the same, why his skin wasn't the same as hers or Marcos's. Each time she held him, the question seemed stronger, more urgent. Marcos, when confronted with the suggestion of the test, became visibly uncomfortable. His expression tightened in for the first time in a long time. Carolina noticed a certain restlessness in his demeanor. He didn't answer immediately, but his gaze, which had previously seemed distant, was now avoidant. He seemed to be running away from the conversation, as if he feared the consequences of a simple paternity test. It was a palpable fear, something she couldn't ignore. Marcos had never been one to hide his feelings, but that night he seemed more like a concrete wall, rigid, impenetrable. Carolina felt a shiver run down her spine. Something was very wrong. She then began to think more deeply about what was happening in her life. She remembered the previous months, the little things that had happened and now seemed to be connected. There were Marcos's absences, the times when he said he was working, the pointless arguments, the forced smiles. At first, she thought it was just work stress, the pressure of having a baby on the way. But now she knew there was something more. Something he was hiding, and that the distance from him only grew with each passing day. The void he was leaving in her life was becoming unbearable. She needed answers. The request for the DNA test was made, and the wait began. Carolina didn't know what to expect, but she felt that, somehow, her life would never be the same after that moment. Over the next few days, the house seemed colder and colder. Marcos continued to avoid her, and Carolina wondered if he already knew the answer. There was something in his posture that made her think he was just waiting for the right moment to reveal what he knew. But what did he know? What had he been hiding? His silence began to weigh on her more than any words. Marcos's behavior no longer made sense, and his physical and emotional absence was the biggest obstacle for Carolina. She was alone, really alone, with a baby in her arms and the fear of what she was about to discover. The days dragged on until the DNA test finally arrived. When Carolina opened it, what she found on the pages wasn't just the result of a paternity test. It was the key to a dark secret, something she had never thought possible. The first piece of information was devastating. The baby was not Marcos's. He was not genetically related to the child she had just given birth to. But what was even more alarming was what came next, something that would leave Carolina speechless. The real father's name was there, printed on the document, and the surprise was indescribable. The name that appeared on the result was not that of a stranger, but of someone who was part of Marcos's life in a way that Carolina would never have imagined. The name was that of a man very close to their family, someone who had been more than just a friend. He was the brother of one of Marcos's most trusted people, a man with whom he had always had a friendly and trusting relationship. The name there was Tiago, Marcos's brother-in-law, the man who, on his frequent visits, was always welcomed with smiles and long conversations. Carolina was paralyzed, not knowing what to make of this information. At first, she thought it was some kind of mistake, but as she looked at the baby in her arms, something inside her began to understand the magnitude of the situation. The pain of knowing that the man she trusted, the one she had built a life with, was involved in a betrayal so deep, so intimate, was unbearable. But the worst was yet to come. Not only had she been betrayed by Marcos, but she had been deceived by someone she trusted completely, someone with whom she shared meals and conversations, someone who had always been considered part of the family. Every minute, the weight of the truth became more crushing. Carolina knew that her life would never be the same after that moment. The lies and secrets had destroyed everything she thought was safe. And the cruelest thing of all was that, while she was heartbroken, while she was trying to find a way to move on, Marcos was silent, as if he knew exactly what she would discover. And he wasn't there to face her. He was just waiting for time to pass. The truth she had feared had come out, and now she had to deal with the emotional devastation of a secret that had irreversibly destroyed her. Carolina didn't know how, but she felt that everything around her was starting to fall apart. What she had discovered was not just a betrayal by her husband, but a deep blow that made her question every part of her life, every relationship she had built. That DNA test didn't just provide an answer, it confirmed that the world she knew was in ruins. Her heart was still in shock, her blood cold, and her thoughts clouded. Tiago's name in the paternity test was repeated in her mind over and over again, like an echo that kept reverberating. That morning, Carolina had decided that she was going to confront Marcos. She could no longer live in uncertainty, could no longer hide the pain inside her, waiting for an explanation that might never come. She found him in the living room, sitting on the sofa, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The baby was in her arms, silent, and yet his presence seemed louder, more real than it had ever been before. She watched him for a moment, trying to control the emotions that were about to explode. What would she do now? It was then that she faced him, and her words came out as a whisper at first, but soon took on strength. Marcos, I know the truth. These words were not just a relief, but a plea for justice. Carolina's voice, although shaky, was filled with an inner strength she had never known she possessed. She felt as if the weight of the world had been placed on her shoulders, but also a force of determination that prevented her from backing down. Marcos didn't react immediately. He simply looked at her, as if he knew that the confrontation was coming, that he could no longer run away from it. But it was his silence that hurt her the most. The lack of any kind of surprise or regret on his face made her feel even more alone. How could he be so impassive, as if he were watching a movie instead of living it? How could he, with such indifference, look at her, knowing how destroyed she was inside? I don't know what you mean, Carolina, Marcos's words lacked conviction, as if he were trying to cling to a lie that no longer made sense. He knew he could no longer escape. She reached out with a DNA test and placed it in front of him. The paper was there, the irrefutable proof of his betrayal, and yet he remained quiet, showing no sign of guilt. Carolina's pain intensified. There was no more room for empty words. What she wanted now was the naked truth. The silence was broken by a deep breath from Marcos. He picked up the exam and read the words with an icy calm, and time seemed to stand still. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, distant, as if the weight of the world wasn't falling on him in the same way it had on Carolina. "I don't know what you want me to do. What do you want me to say? I did what I did, and there's no going back." That was like a punch in the stomach. Carolina felt the ground disappear from under her feet. His words were like knives, sharp and painful. He didn't care about her. He didn't care about his son. He didn't care about anything. Deep down, Marcos was saying that he had already done what he thought he should do, that the consequences were just the price he was willing to pay. And Carolina's pain intensified with every second. How could he be so indifferent, so empty? That's when she understood what he was saying. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It wasn't about the lie he had fed for so long. It was about how he saw her, as a piece in his game, a woman he used to fill his space, a woman who meant nothing more than his own ego. What he really wanted, deep down, was for her to accept what he had done, for her to be weak enough to allow him to continue manipulating her. The truth, cruel and ruthless, was clear. He didn't care about her. He didn't care about the baby. He was after something much bigger: control, power, and maybe even revenge. And Carolina, at that moment, had a glimpse of who Marcos really was. The tears started to fall, and Carolina couldn't hold them back any longer. She was broken, but at the same time, something inside her began to rebuild. She looked at Marcos, and for the first time, he didn't see her as a woman he could dominate, but as a mother, as someone who was on a higher level than him, someone who didn't deserve to be treated like that. She wasn't just a victim. She was strong. She was capable of moving on, with or without him. "What you did is unforgivable, Marcos," she said, and her words sounded like a decree, something that couldn't be undone. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable strength in every word. The pain hadn't gone away, but what remained now was the certainty that she didn't need Marcos to be happy. She had already found her inner strength. She had already found the truth, and that was enough. Marcos said no more. He knew that what she was saying was the truth. He knew that she was determined to move on. She didn't need him anymore, and he knew it. At that moment, what he felt was only a deep emptiness, the emptiness of a man who had destroyed everything he had once loved. He didn't know how to repair the damage he had caused, and the last thing he saw was Carolina walking out the door with a baby in her arms, and a determination he knew he could never break. Her life was moving on. She had faced the worst pain, and now with every step she took, she was stronger. Carolina's journey was just beginning. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but she also knew that no challenge would be greater than that moment when she discovered the truth that set her free. That night, as Carolina watched her son sleep peacefully, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced for a long time. The truth, however painful, had become her liberation. Marcos's betrayal and the harshness of the situation had broken her, but at the same time, shaped her. She knew there was still a lot of healing to do, but now she had a strength inside her that she had never known existed. The weight of her pain was being replaced by a quiet but powerful determination. The love she felt for her son was the anchor that held her firm, and the promise she made to herself, never again to accept less than she deserved, propelled her forward. Marcos had shown himself to be who he really was, and now he was out of her life. But most importantly, Carolina had found something she never imagined she could: her own ability to get back on her feet. She knew that her journey would be difficult, that loneliness would still haunt her at times, but now she understood that true strength comes not from waiting for others to save us, but from saving ourselves. Her son, who barely understood what was happening, was being raised by a mother who would not bow to any more lies, any more pain. The future, although uncertain, was within reach. Carolina didn't have all the answers, but for the first time she knew that whatever the future brought, she would have everything she needed to move forward: courage, love, and the ability to rebuild herself. She was no longer the woman who had been betrayed and abandoned. She was a mother, a strong and determined woman, and her journey was now just beginning. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.